picture's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello BookTube, I'm Sean the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel. Here I am with a book review of Barbara Pym's 1961 novel, No Fond Return of Love. This was another 5-star read for me, as all of Barbara Pym's novels have been up to now. I'm reading them in sequence. This was maybe one of her strangest novels to date, and in a way most compelling for that reason. I did this as a buddy read with Ange from Beyond the Pages, and what a great time we had comparing chapter by chapter. That was just fantastic. The first thing to say is that this is the last Barbara Pym novel that was published until the late 1970s. Her publisher, Jonathan Cape, refused the next novel that she submitted, and she went into the literary wilderness until she had her Tina Turner comeback in about 1977. So that was in the background for me. That was on my mind as I was reading the novel, and I felt some of the energy of the Barbara Pym heroine feeling herself becoming outdated and passé and superfluous, bleeding through from Barbara Pym's own life and bleeding through from the novel perhaps into Barbara Pym's own life, and that made this a really rich reading experience. This is a madcap novel. All the Barbara Pym novels I've read have been really humorous, but this one I would say was madcap, almost to a fault. The plot was just silly in places, but really funny, and in a way that was capacious enough to allow for some really dark, deep reflections by the protagonist, Dulcie Mainwaring. She's not as old as she seems. I was surprised later in the novel to find out that she's younger than a lot of the other characters in the novel, but she seems like an old spinster, and she thinks of herself that way, and she's putting herself down as a unmarried, broken-hearted woman who is an indexer and a kind of a copy editor. The novel opens with her going to a learned conference where the keynote address is on some of the problems of an editor. And the woman in the dormitory room next door is Viola, and Viola is a little prickly. Dulcie is nursing her broken heart because she had somewhat recently broken up with her fiance and felt like that probably had been her last chance at marital bliss. And they kind of bond. They bond over the fact that Viola hints at some recent love affair with the keynote address speaker. His name is Aylwin Forbes, and as soon as Dulcie sees him and listens to his speech and interacts with him a bit, she develops a really deep crush on Aylwin, which she doesn't tell Viola about. It's crazy. Viola, quite surprisingly, a few weeks later, asks if she can move in with Dulcie. Dulcie is unmarried and has recently had her university-age niece, Laurel, come to live with her in London, and she says sure. Meanwhile, Dulcie becomes obsessed with Aylwin Forbes. Obsessed as a researcher, she goes to the library. Let me read you part of this passage. For this was really the kind of research Dulcie enjoyed most of all. Investigation, some might have said prying into the lives of other people. The kind of work that involved poring over reference books and street and telephone directories. It was most satisfactory if the objects of her research were not too well known, either to herself or to the world in general. For it was rather dull just to be able to look up somebody in Who's Who, which gave so many relevant details. Crockford was better, because it left more to the imagination, not stooping to such personal trivia as marriages or children or recreations. Love was a powerful incentive to this kind of research, and ridiculous and impossible though it obviously was, Dulcie did feel that she had fallen a little in love with Aylwin Forbes. I should say everybody knows Who's Who, but Crockford, Google tells me, was the Anglican Church clergy biographical directory. So Dulcie, in a researcher, investigative, sleuth kind of way, starts stalking Aylwin and his family. And she finds out that he has a brother who's a clergyman of the Anglo-Catholic Church. And she sneaks off to his church. We find out in the first chapter that Elwyn and his wife are separated. Dulcie, through her library sleuthing, finds out that Elwyn Forbes' mother-in-law lives nearby, so she wanders by the mother-in-law's house. That's where Elwyn's wife is staying during the separation, and lo and behold, they're having the British 1961 equivalent of a garage sale, and so she waltzes in and under an assumed name starts talking to the mother-in-law and talking to Elwyn's estranged wife, buys a little trinket. Meanwhile, Viola is living with her, and she kind of tells her some of it, but she doesn't tell her all of it. But Viola is still very interested in Elwyn, and she's doing an index for him, and that's a running joke through the book, that Viola's only real connection to him now is that he's hired her to do an index, but they'd had this kiss a few months back. It gets even further madcap when they find out that Elwyn's mother runs an inn in Devon, and they go there on a holiday, and the plot just twists like that in a way that it doesn't really make any sense. It's actually almost too silly, but what kept me going and what made this crazy plot notwithstanding a 5-star read was the way that Barbara Pym plays with the conventions of the literary romance novel and inserts herself into this story in a cameo and puts her books on the shelf in the various bedrooms in the novel, along with other famous and rather antiquated romance novels. Elwyn himself is named after the title of a late 19th century novel by Theodore Watts Dunton, and his famous novel was Elwyn. There's a scene at Mrs. Forbes' Devon Hotel where an unnamed late 40s female British novelist is sitting there, and nobody pays her any attention because they have no idea that she's the novelist whose books they enjoy, and she just seems like a frumpy spinster. Throughout all of that, the madcap plot, my heart was wrenched by the way that Dulcie was starting to fall apart. She started forgetting why she was investigating Elwyn Forbes and his brother, and she was drinking too much and at weird times of the day and doing really inappropriate things and putting herself down all the time and worrying about turning into a spinster aunt. And in the background of all that, I kept thinking, this is the last novel that Barbara Pym published for almost 2 decades, because her publisher said her stories had gone out of style. They weren't what the modern reader wanted anymore. And I actually started to feel like I just wanted to give Barbara Pym a hug, because what Dulcie was so worried about in her own personal life, becoming irrelevant and nonsensical and just cast off as a outdated, passé spinster, was a foreshadowing of what was about to happen to Barbara Pym literarily in just a couple of years. And that really pulled me into and deepened what otherwise was kind of a really silly story. And I love this novel. It was sad, Dulcie says. It was sad, she thought, how women longed to be needed and useful, and how seldom most of them really were. There are a lot of improbable boy meets girl, aging man meets aging woman, and they come together in the typical British romance novel closure, a la Jane Austen, a la Shakespeare, a la, in some cases, but rather comedically and in a really problematized way, a la Barbara Pym. But I loved the way this one gestured towards that happily ever after ending, but stopped just short of it, so that there was space for us to wonder, what will Dulcie do? Will she opt for happily ever after ending that romance novels steer their women towards, or will she strike off in a new feminist Betty Friedan way and keep on doing her scholarly stuff and being an independent woman? I loved that Barbara Pym left space for that kind of readerly conjecture, and I can't wait to read the next novel, which was published in about 1978, to see where Barbara Pym's literary, romantic, deeply comedic, and compassionate imagination will take her fiction next. That is my review of No Fond Return of Love by Barbara Pym. Thanks for watching.